Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Kishore Volodi, and today we are joined with Sarah Bookout, who's going to be joining us to talk about a lot of really great topics when it comes to our teens and adults with Down syndrome, when it comes to relationships and social communications and independence and all these important topics that we definitely want to make sure that we cover here on the podcast today. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why you love working with this population?
Thank you. Yes, I am Sarah Bookout. I have my doctorate from Northwestern in speech language pathology, and I've been working with Down syndrome as a population for about 5 or 6 years.
Hmm.
And I got started right out of grad school in Colorado with Jennifer Gray. So I have had quite a lot of experience working, especially with teens and adults with Down syndrome. It's my favorite population to work with. I also love working with the little ones. I work with them quite a bit too at Gigi's Playhouse, but I do a lot of teletherapy with teens and adults with Down syndrome and have found that teletherapy as a modality itself is such a great tool and skill for those with Down syndrome and any type of intellectual disability to learn how to use and can be such a great mode for therapy. I really love working with this population mostly because of all the different personalities. I've got so many different characters that I work with, and I love all of them. They're as a whole sweet and genuine and excited to work with me, but also individually all so different and have different
Yeah.
strengths and different things that they need to work on. And as a speech therapist or speech language pathologist, I love working with this population because we get to work on speech clarity, we get to work on language skills, we get to work on pragmatic skills. If you're into feeding and swallowing, there's an area for that too.
Yeah.
Not as much my thing, but there's an area of need for that with this population, as well as fluency and literacy skills and cognition and executive functioning. So, really, any part of what we learn in school as speech language pathologists, there's a need for that skill to work on with people with Down syndrome. So, I'm never bored and often surprised based on
Yes,
who I'm working with.
that's great. I guess is there anything in particular that draws you to this population, or was it just happened to be where you just said, "Hey, this is something that these people I love working with, this group of people."
Yeah, I finished up my clinical externship in the midst of COVID starting. So in
Mm.
2020. So this job working with people with Down syndrome just kind of fell into my lap. And I had, been interested in working with the deaf and hard of hearing population right out of grad school, or maybe more the medical side of things. And I talked to Jennifer Gray about different opportunities to work with people with Down syndrome, and she shared with me a lot of people with Down syndrome are deaf and hard of hearing, have hearing loss, have hearing aids. I have a client right now who has cochlear implants, and there is such a medical piece to it. So even though it wasn't what I had envisioned, it kind of fit
Mhm.
into what I was interested in.
Yeah.
And then once I started working with this group, I found a whole other layer of interests to focus on, such as relationships and social communication and all things like that. So,
Cool.
really, there wasn't anything specific that led me to working with people with Down syndrome. But now that I have, I can't imagine working with any other group.
Oh my goodness, I love that. I love that. And we've had Jennifer on the podcast before as well, so it's really, really great. I think we might be setting a record. I think the most number of guests that I have had that have been SLP, speech language pathologists, is probably at the highest now. So
Oh,
you've
wow.
we have so many people in this field that love working with this population. So we are glad to have you on the podcast today. And today I wanted to see if maybe we could do a little bit of talking about teens and adults and some of the things that you work on with that population in your clinical practice. So let's start off by talking about relationships, and navigating friendships and dating and these types of things. Give us a little bit about that.
Yes, it's an area that I never imagined that I would be focusing on or specializing in or putting a lot of emphasis on within speech language pathology. I thought I would be focused on speech clarity
Hmm.
or answering questions, but really, when you work with teens and adults, you really have to think about, why are we still doing this? Why are we still doing speech therapy? Because a lot of them have had it since 3 or younger, depending on the services that were available to them, or definitely in school. And so when we're working with teens and adults, I always talk to them about the reason why. Why do we work together? Why do we want to do this? Why do I want to do this? Because half the time they'll say, well, I don't. But when we talk about what is the reason to have good speech and language skills, it comes down to having other people understand them. And if they're not understood, they're going to have a hard time making friends. They're going to have a hard time developing relationships. They're going to have a hard time getting jobs, all the layers that go into that. So, having friendships and relationships be one of the goals that I work on really creates a lot of buy in from the people that I'm working with. As well as just by asking them some questions about their friendships and about their personal relationships, I've noticed big gaps. I'll ask them, who's your best friend, just to have a conversation topic for us to dive into, or a person's name for me to refer to. And oftentimes they'll say that I'm their best friend, or mom is their best friend, or their sister. And then so I've started talking more about, well, what is a best friend? And they can't really give me an answer. Or even if you take away best friend and just a friend, who is a friend? They can't really give me an answer. And I had one client tell me right now his best friend or his close friend at work is this woman whose name he mentioned. And I said, okay, well, what do you know about her? I don't know.
Hmm.
And I said, okay, so how come she's your friend? Well, she waves at me and wants to sit next to me at lunch sometimes. Okay, so this person waves at you, wants to sit next to you at lunch. Do you know where she lives? Nope. Do you know if she has a family? Nope. Do you know what she likes to do after work? Nope. So is that really a friend, or is that an acquaintance that's polite and kind? And as much as I don't like to be the person that comes in and says, those people that are smiling at you and waving are not your friends, I do that pretty often because I want to talk to them about how to build real friendships, especially thinking about the future. If people with Down syndrome are living longer and maybe outliving family members who are their close inner circle, who do they have in their lives after that? And
Hmm.
so those skills definitely need to start before teen and adult years. They need to start younger in school. We need to have the expectation that people with Down syndrome initiate and maintain friendships. And it's something that we have to teach. And I think it's something that we have to teach because a lot of their lives have been adults asking them questions.
Hmm.
How are you? Are you hungry? Do you want to play? Do you want to sit here? Are you feeling good? Or asking them to repeat stuff back to us, but we're not really giving them a chance to ask others questions and initiate conversation. We're not teaching that skill. They just kind of sit and wait to be asked something. And so then what we see in teens and adults is they don't know how to initiate a friendship or initiate a conversation to build a friendship. So, with that gap that I've noticed and I've realized, and especially teens the first couple years after high school or their transition program, where they went from being in a class with the same people since kindergarten, or even just the last 4 years of high school, maybe being prom king, maybe being on the basketball team, really included in their community at school, to being at home without a mode of transportation because they can't drive, and maybe at 20 years old using Uber or public transportation isn't the safest option. They're reliant on their parents' schedules to have social interactions. They might be limited on social media because of reasoning skills and safety. So really they become very isolated, and there's lots of instances of depression in this population. And in that window of time when they haven't found a groove yet of what to do after school ends, And that is where I really work on friendships. So, something we talk about is who is a friend? What does a friend look like? How do we communicate with a friend? How do we be a good friend? And kind of that role play scenario. And then I try my hardest in private practice to have opportunities for my clients to meet each other, even if it's over Zoom to practice some of our social skills. Even if it's, once every 6 months, we do a park day, just something to help bridge what we've talked about during therapy into real life. As well as doing small groups. But schedules can be hard and tricky. And I know a big part of why some of my clients with Down syndrome maybe are more isolated and at home more often is because they don't have the free time in their schedule. Their parents maybe are both working. They might be relying on a sibling who's still in school to be their mode of transportation. So even if there are social opportunities available, they can't always participate because of limitations in that sense too.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where I'm at with friendships right now
Yeah.
and why I think it's so important to work on that as like a foundational skill.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely, as you're talking about it, it makes me think about, the patients that come to see me in clinic, and very often, you're right, it's me initiating the questions more often than in the other direction. So that's definitely something that is super interesting. What about you? You had mentioned earlier when we were talking just offline about, relationships relating to dating and things that you talk with them about. How does that conversation go? What do you guys talk about there?
Yeah, so it all depends on the person with Down syndrome, on their level of interest in dating and how they approach it. But usually I find that they're typical teenagers. Well, what I really find is that my clients who are in their early 20s are maybe hormonally and relationship-esque similar to those who are maybe 14, 15, 16. And
Mm.
that is when they're really kind of diving into what relationships are like, thinking about relationships, noticing it in movies or with friends or with their parents, and showing an interest in that. While my clients who are, young teenagers, 13, 14, 15, are typically still maybe interested in some like sports or toys at home. They're not necessarily interested in relationships where with clients who don't have Down syndrome, I feel like maybe that's shifted a little bit, just like we've seen with everything else with people with Down syndrome developmentally delayed a little bit. I also see that with interest in relationships. There's kind of a theme. It's like 19 and older, they seem to really show interest. So within that group, it is hard, as I mentioned, because they're showing this interest in relationships, but they don't have access to a social network like they would if they were still in school to practice the skills of dating or to build relationships, and to kind of see what dating is like because now they're out of school and maybe don't have the opportunities to. And so, what I've found is that a lot of my clients who bring up dating talk about girls or boys on TikTok, on social media, on a TV show that maybe even aired 10 years ago, but they still see that person on the screen and think, oh, that could be my boyfriend or girlfriend. Um, Singers, anybody in pop culture, but and I think more than the influence of social media, I think it's the lack of opportunity to engage in person with others. But I do have a few who are on college campuses or in a transition program, a 21 and old, or I think it's 18 to 21 program, and they'll all bring up relationships in a little bit different ways. I usually don't bring it up unless they are maybe 20, 21, and we're kind of figuring out what to work on, what are some personal goals after friendship. And I might say, oh, are you interested in anybody? Are you interested in dating? Just to kind of see what they say.
Hmm.
And because I see them multiple times a week and I might be the only person that they're seeing one on one really interacting with them. A lot of my clients and I have pretty close relationships, and they feel comfortable maybe sharing with me an interest that they haven't shared with their parents in dating. And some will tell me, please don't tell my mom. And some will say, oh, I have a date with someone that my mom introduced me to so and so's niece. That never seems to go as well when parents try to set them up. But something we talk about with relationships, I use a lot of video modeling. We pull clips off of YouTube from different TV shows that depict dating, different just social interactions between people who are on a first date, and talk about, okay, what did they do right? What did they do wrong? And a big thing I love to talk about, just first thing to get it out in the open and off the table, is to talk about what are things that you should not do or say on a date, because they're thinking it, they really want to say it, and they know what is not appropriate. And if we can say it out loud, write it down, put it in the don't category, I find that we can move past it and it not come up in conversation while they're on a date or during a role play situation, rather than just ignoring it. So a rule that I kind of have established with one of my clients who has gotten in trouble on college campuses for maybe giving too many personal compliments about appearance and physical features of women. We talk about how compliments should not be about how somebody looks. You might say, oh, you seem really happy today, or I really like the comments you make in class, or we might talk about like shoes or something like that, but we talk a lot about how we don't talk about somebody's body as a compliment. And it's something that they see in movies and hear other people say all the time. But the hardest part with dating with people with Down syndrome is picking up on that nonverbal cues and reading the room in terms of when it's right to say a compliment that talks about how somebody looks and when it's not going to be as well received. And that is very, very hard to teach. And so it's kind of safer to just have some very black and white rules depending on the setting. Also, I found a lot of times my clients, they're around their family members all the time or social media, and that's it. So there's some confusion where if I have a cousin and she's my age, why can't she be my girlfriend? And that's cute when they're 6, but when they're 27, it's not anymore. And it makes other people feel uncomfortable, and it makes that family member feel uncomfortable. And I talk a lot with my clients about, if someone feels uncomfortable, are they going to want to talk to you more or less? And we want our individuals with Down syndrome to have as much communication and social interaction as possible. We don't want them to be in a situation where there's a driving wedge between them and family members or friends. So it's a lot of talking about the rules. It's a lot of very clear black and white, who can we date and who can't we date? And then talking about how to build a conversation. And depending on the client and their strengths, we talk about how to read the vibe or read the nonverbal cues of, can we proceed with asking them out on a date, or do we get the sense they just want to be friends? And what I do love about working with this population is they're very direct and they're not afraid to be direct. And that's how dating should go. Asking those direct questions of, we've talked quite a bit the last couple of weeks. Are you interested in going on a date with me? And that's the perfect way to handle it. So it's a lot of problem solving in the moment, because things come up. Once someone gets a girlfriend, a lot of like, I love yous happen really fast, and a lot of maybe confusion from one side or the other about the timeline of how things are supposed to move. So with my clients, all of them, I have make visuals with me. I have visual materials that I can share with other therapists, but I like to have that individual person create it with me on what friendship means, what a romantic relationship means, what we can and can't say, who we can and can't date, and then a timeline of what a relationship looks like, and having them create it with me, and then having those visuals for them to keep at home and go over with their family is something that I think is really important. And I think for parents to kind of take a deep breath and embrace it is really important too. I think a lot of times, just like any parent would, they're not ready for their child to maybe explore the dating world. They're worried about them getting hurt, they're worried about the safety of it. But I found the ones that don't have that communication with their parents are exploring dating apps that they can download on their phone, and exploring TikTok and Instagram and befriending people that they don't know because they're seeking
Mhm.
those relationships. So it's always better to have the conversation, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that. That's super helpful because, when we think about friendships and dating and the importance of communication and all of those appropriate communication and all of those things, I think it's so important. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more in terms of, as you think about social communication, what are some ways that you approach that topic with people with Down syndrome?
Yeah, we talk about the importance of social communication and always explaining the why. If I'm bringing a topic for us to work on or a new area of speech for us to tackle, I always start by asking my teens and adults, why are we working on this? Why is it important? And see what they can answer. A lot of times it's, I don't know, but at least they're thinking about it. And then we're able to have that conversation because it's in their mind, they're able to connect back to it later. So we talk about why social communication is important in terms of building friendships, getting to know each other better, and really we talk about being interested in other people. And people with Down syndrome, I will not say it's a blanket statement, are or are not interested in other people. It really just depends on the person, just like the rest of us. It's kind of a personality type. If we are really good at making friends, if we are really extroverted in the sense that we want to build relationships with other people and have a ton of in our social circle, or if we're comfortable just having one or two close friends and have a smaller circle. And I would say that's similar with people with Down syndrome. But a lot of times, even the ones that want to build that social circle and have a lot of people in their lives, they know how to ask, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite food? What's your favorite dog? But
Hmm.
not always questions that finds out truly more valuable information about another person. And I've found with a lot of my clients that they might ask me, what did you do this weekend? And I'll say, oh, I went on a really fun trip. And then they just stare and smile at me. But there isn't a follow up question. So that's kind of been the theme of my last 6 months of therapy, just really working on follow up questions,
Hmm.
because we might break it down and they really nail the introductory question of how was your weekend or what are you doing tomorrow. But then when they have an answer, they sit with it, or they'll say, that's cool, but there's no follow up to it.
Hmm.
And that's mostly because we haven't expected it and haven't taught it in schools or in speech therapy. But it's just kind of been like, okay, we got something, now we can move on to the next. Or if they have a communication partner who is really good at communicating, they fill in the blanks. Anytime there's an awkward pause, someone's going to ask a question to keep it going, especially if it's, a friend of the family or a sibling's friend that's over and they want to engage with this person with Down syndrome, but feel maybe a little uncomfortable. They're not going to pause and wait for that person to think of the question they want to ask. They're going to fill it in to keep the conversation going, which is
Yeah.
only natural. So when we work on social communication, a lot of follow up and a lot of visual supports. I love teletherapy because I can put the topic or the question up on the screen. I can color code things. So I'll do like blue for topics, purple for questions, orange for answers. And we'll keep track of who asked the most questions and who stayed on topic, who changed the topic, all those kinds of things where it's really a conversation with a visual representation so that we can talk about where it broke down and where we need to go back and fix it. But teaching our clients with Down syndrome to be interested in others can be really hard.
Hmm.
And I don't even think it's a lack of interest, but a lack of knowing what to do next and
Yeah.
that feeling uncomfortable. And just not being aware of the expectations for a conversation or who we should be interested in getting to know. And what I mean by that is I have a client I'm thinking of. We had a park day and had everybody and their families together, and we played basketball and had a picnic and everything. And this one particular client sat by himself and was interested in talking to the adults, but didn't want to interact with his peers or just didn't know how to interact with his peers, but knew that adults were the safe ones to talk to because they were going to ask the questions and there wasn't going to be any uncomfortable silences. So he felt more safe in conversation with someone he knew was going to be able to do the work to carry the conversation versus trying to talk to another one of his peers that maybe also had communication
Hmm.
difficulties. And along with that, I have another client who prefers to not date other people with Down syndrome, specifically because he finds conversations are hard. He can't always understand what they're saying, and he feels like they never ask him any questions. And I love to point out, well, you don't ask me any questions
Right.
either.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
yeah, it's interesting to see what some of them bring to me as problems in social communication because oftentimes it's exactly what they do in conversation without even realizing it. So it's kind of a good self-monitoring system too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know another area that you're really focused in on is on supporting independence and the functional skills, executive functional skills that people with Down syndrome can develop in that regard. Fill us in a little bit about that.
Yes. So executive functioning kind of runs everything in terms of cognition and communication. To be able to have language and speech, we have to be able to think and plan and organize our thoughts and initiate and problem solve all in the moment. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of skill. And individuals with Down syndrome have those skills, but maybe don't always have the supports they need to use them in the best way. So, something that I think is one of the most important ones, it seems to be the hardest, is time management. The concept of time is very abstract and very
Mhm.
difficult to teach. And it seems to be something that a lot of my teens and adults have a hard time with. They might want to talk about yesterday, but they'll say last year. Or I'll ask them the day of the week and they might tell me May.
Hmm.
So it's interesting that like time itself can be a little difficult. Not with everybody, but it seems to be a theme. Um, but because of that, planning for a job and planning for social hangouts and planning for even just like routines of daily activities of when I need to take a shower to be ready to go um, have breakfast and then get ready to go to work or to school. A lot of times parents are doing that as they should, but at a certain age, it's hard to know when to pull back with our individuals with Down syndrome to let them practice those skills on their own. And
Hmm.
sometimes it's just easier if we just tell them when to do it so that it gets done and we can get out the door. But if we think about where our teens and adults with Down syndrome are going to be in 10 or 15 years, they might not have us there to push them out the door, to set their timers for them, to set
Hmm.
their alarms, to build their schedule and remind them of appointments. And those are all part of that executive functioning bubble that they need to be able to master to be independent and live independent lives. And when I think of independence and talk about being independent to my clients, I'm thinking about, can they feed themselves? Can they clean themselves? And then Can they plan and pay attention to where they need to go and when they need to be there? So they don't necessarily need to learn skills to drive. I don't have any that have their driver's license. I have a few that are very interested, but that's
Uh-huh.
between them and their parents and the DMV. But really working on those basic steps can be broken down into different activities. So I love to work on cooking, and I'll do cooking classes, I'll do sessions where we do cooking recipes, and I might be the one cooking over teletherapy, but they're reading the menu, they're reading the ingredients and materials, we're talking about the steps. I ask a lot of questions like, what comes next? Why would that come next? What do you think would happen if? And they're really having to think and problem solve in those activities and build those skills, because out in the real world, they would have to. And
Mhm.
then we also talk about laundry being a good way to practice because you're following multiple step directions. Can you think of what needs to happen next? Can you remember the steps that need to happen and the steps you've already done? And you have a finished product at the end of the activity of laundry to know if you've done it right or not. So there's some of that feedback there to tell you if you have or not. And then in terms of like social relationships and friendships and social communication, there's a lot of self-monitoring and adjusting behavior that has to happen for independence and growth of relationships that has to do with executive functioning. So they have to be thinking, am I talking loud enough for them to hear? Am I standing too close or too far away from my communication partner? Did I answer the question correctly? Can I read all of this on somebody's face? Or what cues are going to tell me that? And then also adjusting their behavior. Okay, if I am coming off a little too strong or if I'm being a little too silly, how can they modify that to fit back into the situation rather than just walk away or give up in the conversation, which I have seen a lot. So there's a lot of executive functioning pieces that factor into those daily life skills, whether it's an activity of daily living or a conversation that we can work on and focus on.
I think that's great, and it's so important. This ability to communicate and communicate effectively is going to play such a huge role in how they can advocate for themselves and live independently and as much as possible in their daily lives. To be able to live those lives independently. I feel like so much of what we've covered today really highlights a lot of those topics. Is there anything along those lines that you want to make sure that you leave with our listeners? Maybe some tips that you might give to a family that lives far, far away from you. They're not going to be able to see you in clinic. Like, what would be some things that you would recommend that they work on at home to build those skills?
Yeah, I would say bring the thought of speech and language and executive functioning into everyday activity.
Mm,
So give that responsibility to the person with Down syndrome. Expect it early, expect that they can do it. And then if they need help, support them in asking for help instead of
mm,
just standing there and watching, or instead of jumping in and doing it for them. Support them in asking for help, that self advocacy piece, but have them set their own alarms, have them make their own breakfast, have them pack their lunch the night before, have them start talking about the future and what the future looks like, and ask them the questions that you would ask other children. What do you want to be when you grow up? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What are you looking forward to this summer? To start thinking about those time concepts, but also
mm.
setting goals. Talk about what friendships and dating and romantic relationships look like, and prompt them to ask questions. But
Yeah.
I think really giving them as much independence and taking care of themselves at home is one of the best things you can do in thinking about the future. Having them do chores just like other children, having that they can do it mindset. And then if they can't and need help or support, we can provide it. We can jump in and add those supports in, but assume competence, and then also give them that confidence that helps them in the future as well. If they know I can do laundry all by myself, or I can make eggs all by myself, or I can make grilled cheese all by myself. So many of my clients are so excited to tell me those things. And that's because their families trusted them to do that and they feel responsible. And I think talking about independence in a positive way and talking about responsibility in a positive way, really our clients want that and they buy into it. So yeah, at home, at the grocery store, out shopping, even at the airport, see if they can help find the gate by
I love
following
that.
directions.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Awesome. Wow. Thank you. I want to make sure that we leave our listeners with any resources or anything that you think would be helpful for them. And I can share these in the show notes as well. But are there any specific resources that you would recommend that families can find on their own that you would suggest for them in this topic?
Yes, I think that Gigi's Playhouse is such a good place for resources and for just different programs that they offer. They have cooking classes, they have workout classes, they have speech programs that are all free for individuals with Down syndrome and their families. And so I would say the social group piece, the activity, getting out into the community piece, and some of their classes and courses that work on being independent is a really great place, especially for those right out of high school when they're really not sure what to do next. I think that's a great one.
Mm.
On our website, connectedspeech.org, we have a lot of materials for parents with ideas of ways to work on speech and language at home, all the way from birth through adulthood. I think that is really, really important and a good place to look. And then a lot of universities also have, if you search adult programs for people with Down syndrome, even if they do not enroll in one of those programs, they'll have a little bit of a checklist of, where can we look for resources. They also have ideas of ways to practice certain skills or an idea of skills that your adult with Down syndrome should be able to master and have by the time they enroll in college, if that is a goal for theirs.
Hmm.
And then I would say local employment programs sometimes will have kind of a prep course or strategies to work on to help your adult with Down syndrome have the skills that they need to become employed. I think that can be really helpful too. And then there's Down syndrome associations for major cities, and they also have not just events and advocacy information, but they'll also have resources for different activities and places in the community. And then the last one is the National Down Syndrome Congress, that is a yearly conference for families with individuals with Down syndrome. The whole family's invited, siblings are invited, parents are invited. I speak there every year, the last 4 years, along with Jennifer Gray. And it has been such a fun place to meet families, but also learn about new resources. And every year they have it in a different state. And each state has their own individual resources along with global resources. And then I guess one more. The last one is LSVT is a very interesting program that helps a lot with clear speech. And clear speech is kind of the kickstarter for everything else. If you have clear speech, then you are understood by your peers and it adds that confidence. And then we can start talking about the language aspect once we have that clear speech. The LSVT Global is a program that has done a lot of research recently with individuals with Down syndrome and is showing a lot of promising work there. So those are all
Wow,
my
those are
little
great.
plugs.
Those are great. Yes. Thank you so much again for joining us on the podcast to talk about this important topic, which you're clearly passionate about, which is wonderful. And so thanks again for joining us on the podcast.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
Yes, and to our listeners, if you have any questions that you want us to answer on future podcasts, please send me an email at downsyndromecenter@chp.edu. And if you want to contribute to what we're doing at this center, including this podcast, please go to givetochildrens.org/Down Syndrome Center. But until next time, bye bye.